Right. Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much. My name is Sarah Monroe. I serve as the Curator of Engagement and Outreach here at Museum London. Thank you for joining us. Gathering together at the significant location at the forks of the Thames River, the Deshkanzibi, we begin by respectfully acknowledging that Museum London is situated upon the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoak, and the Audouindan peoples. For countless generations, this place has served as a vital crossroads, a gathering place where communities have come together in connection and shared purpose. It is with profound respect and humility that we commit ourselves to advancing our work with integrity, fostering meaningful collaboration as we walk together on a path towards reconciliation. It feels especially fitting tonight to host this book launch here, a place where art, culture, and public dialogue intersect. Tonight, we celebrate Trading on Art by Sarah E.K. Smith, a timely exploration of how Canadian artists engaged with, contested, and reflected on free trade to circulate ideas about North American identity. Through exhibitions, activist works, and museum programs from the 1980s to 2010, Smith reveals, how art served as a powerful medium to both examine and challenge the promises and pitfalls of North American economic policy. These themes resonate powerfully with the Realignment series by London-based artist Bob Bozak, which is installed at the entrance to the museum, and I invite you to visit following this talk. Bozak's sculptures draw on the aesthetics of the automotive industry, an industry that has long been central to Southwestern Ontario's economy and identity, and deeply affected by the shifting dynamics of today's trade policies. Bozak's laser-cut sculptures use glossy finishes, vibrant color, and iconic typefaces to mimic the language of car branding, with slogans like Epic Triumph, American Eclipse, and Intrepid Impulse. These poke humorously at the aspirational names car manufacturers invent to inspire visions of status, power, and freedom, and how these ideals are tied to constant consumption. In this way, Bozak's work echoes the argument of Trading on Art, that cultural production is not separate from economic life, but embedded in it and also challenging it, perhaps suggesting a realignment. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd want to thank our program partner, Josh Lambier, and our guest speakers, Sarah E.K. Smith, Judith Rodger, and Ruth Skinner, for bringing their voices and insights to this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to all of you who are joining us here this afternoon, both here on site at Museum London and online, who are joining us via Zoom. So good to have you with us. I would like to start off by offering my warm thanks to the entire team here at Museum London for welcoming us, the Words Festival, back to this gorgeous space, the Center at the Forks, to launch Dr. Sarah Smith's new book, Trading on Art, Cultural Diplomacy and Free Trade in North America. Here is a copy of the book. Everybody should get it from the Western Bookstore while you're here with us. I would also like to thank, and I'm very grateful to Judith Rodger and Ruth Skinner, who are joining us as special guests, as Sarah mentioned, to quilt Sarah's opening talk together with a reconsideration of the London regionalist movement and the significance of the arts in the context of free trade debates. Shortly after his election in November of last year, the strange orange man in the big white house sent shockwaves through Canada and the world when he floated the idea of 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Threats that would become real on the 1st of February via his favorite executive order. In the aftermath, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, facing an election with abysmal polling numbers in Canada and taunts of being the governor of the 51st state from the United States, was replaced by Mark Carney, who managed a radically improbable election win under the existential threat of tariffs and annexation. During his campaign in April, Carney grabbed international headlines when he declared, and this is to quote, "President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us And while that will never happen, our world has fundamentally changed. Our old relationship with the United States is over. The idea of North American free trade, enshrined by treaty for decades, is on the brink of collapse. How did this happen in just 6 months' time? More remarkably, how did Sarah Smith know this was going to happen when she launched her book on North American free trade and the arts in the midst of a trade war? Timing is everything, so very good timing. I'm not sure if there was prophecy or somebody whispering in your ear, but that was a remarkable moment. Our turbulent times recalls the observations of two outside observers, two French thinkers who visited North America. And these are two people I thought of when all of this unfolded. One to the U.S. in 1832, the other to Canada in 1937. In his classic work, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville warned of the tyranny of the majority to use its power to abuse a minority or minorities, as well as the despotic rule of one or a few enabled and fueled by the political apathy of the many. A warning 2 centuries ago that still continues to also be prophetic. Another outside observer in Canada you might not have heard of before, French geographer André Siegfried, reported to his readers in Europe between the world wars. He remarked, and this is to quote, that there should be a country called Canada, distinct from the United States, is a mere accident of history. In fact, a political paradox. This is what he says. On the one hand, Canada developed historically along an east-west axis via political frontiers. The railway is probably one of those east-west symbols of Canada that we know. On the other, Siegfried notes a north-south axis that seems almost irresistible, pulling Canada towards, to use his phrase, Pan-Americanism. The Canadian problem, as he called it, was to determine whether our social imaginary would develop east-west or we would fall into the gravitational pull of North American unity. Again, his phrase, along the north-south axis. In 1937, he observed, and this is one passage that I read and I just thought, my goodness, Canadians liked the American cinema, the American radio, American sports, and American papers, and could not do without them. This geographic paradox would inform Canada's Royal Commission on National Development in the Arts, Sciences, and Letters, the Massey Commission of 1949 to 1951, which produced a watershed report for the East-West development of Canadian cultural policy, released in 1951, and it haunted future free trade debates with fears of North-South Americanization. That's from 1937. We still have these echoes of these debates with us into the present. Sarah's new book, Trading on Art, as we will hear shortly, explores another related paradox bound up with art's role in the reinvention and questioning of the idea of North America as an economically cohesive whole, united by free trade. While art was mobilized to frame this new North American imaginary, culture itself was explicitly excluded from the agreements that implemented this vision, excluded as protected grounds, off the table. Related to Siegfried's Canadian problem of east to west, north to south movement, Sarah also explores how art was mobilized to rethink the notion of regionalism in Canada, to reimagine a new transnational regional imaginary, one that would encompass North America as a region constructed by the trade agreements that link Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And yet, the arts also have a way of resisting this new regional notion of North America, as well as other notions of mega regions put forward by thinkers like Richard Florida. In the second half of our program, we will have the pleasure of welcoming Judith Rodger and Ruth Skinner to the stage to bring the thematics of Sarah's book home by revisiting the London regionalism movement, particularly in the case of Greg Curnow, whose map of North America has recently come back to the fore as Donald Trump refers to the 49th parallel as imaginary, that artificially drawn line. To help us navigate these fraught waters, we're very lucky to have Sarah, Judith, and Ruth with us today to talk about the place of the arts in a time of trade war. I will introduce each of them with brief biographical remarks before they speak, and then we'll have some time to field questions from all of you here on site at Museum London as well as online. So put your questions into the chat and start thinking of questions now here in the space. Sarah E.K. Smith is an associate professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University, where she holds a Canada Research Chair in Art, Culture, and Global Relations, and leads the Practitioner Media Lab, a new space. It's gorgeous. I had a chance to see it in creation. She is the author of General Lines, Life and Work, and co-editor of Museum Diplomacy, How Cultural Institutions Shape Global Engagement. She is the co-founder of the Multidisciplinary Research Network, the North American Cultural Diplomacy Initiative, a member of the International Cultural Relations Research Alliance, and an editorial board member of the Canadian Journal of Communication. She also has an active curatorial practice, including a co-curated exhibition you all may recall here in the space at Museum London, From Remote Stars, Buckminster Fuller, London and Speculative Futures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Smith.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's truly a pleasure to be here. I'm really grateful for everybody who's with us online and those of you who are able to join us in person. I'm grateful to be in conversation with Judith Rodgers and Ruth Skinner this evening. And I am also would like to thank the Words Festival and Josh Lambier for organizing this event, as well as extend my sincere thanks to Museum London for hosting us here at the lovely Center on the Forks, which sits at the junction of the Deshkan-Zibi on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, the Attawandaron, within the homelands of the Chippewas of the Thames, the Oneida Nation, and the Munsee Delaware Nations. So trading on art is about how art is wielded by governments to advance relationships and new understandings of identity. And at the same time, how art is simultaneously a medium in which to grapple with and reflect on economic and political developments like free trade. In the book, I focus on the period at the end of the 20th century, so mostly on the 1980s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s, when North America saw sweeping economic integration. I'm sure many of you are aware, of course, that in the 1980s, Canada entered into the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, known as the FTA, which was implemented in 1989. Shortly thereafter, this agreement was superseded by the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which, as we all know, linked Canada, Mexico, and the United States in a free trade alliance that began in 1994. I mean, we were talking about this a lot. It's in the news lately, but it was equally contested in the 1980s and 1990s. But in the moment in which I was starting this book and first thinking about it in the early 21st century, the economic integration of North America really came to a point around the 2010s in which it seemed inevitable and irreversible. Right. Of course, recently, under the administration of U.S. President Trump, North American relationships and trade are back in the headlines. Earlier this year, I was really struck by the parallels between our current tariff war and the debates of the free trade era in the 1980s and 90s. This is just but one example. So in December 2024, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum made headlines when she disparaged Canada, stating that Canada could only wish they had the cultural riches of Mexico, pointing out that her country had civilizations dating back thousands of years. Beyond reflecting the intensity of these debates around North American trade, what stood out for me was President Sheinbaum's mention of quote-unquote cultural riches, this invocation of cultural stature as a means to assert power on the world stage. This statement was strikingly similar to the perspectives voiced by Mexican officials during the 1990s when NAFTA was first being negotiated. As I explain in the book, during the late 20th century, the popular belief was that Canadian culture was at a disadvantage under free trade in comparison to that of the United States, whose culture was perceived and understood to be dominant. This eventually led to the cultural exemption in the free trade agreements. Mexico, however, did not feel at a cultural disadvantage with respect to the United States. And there was this other well-publicized moment that really resonates with Scheinbaum's comments. And this was during the NAFTA negotiations when Mexico's Secretary of Trade and Industrial Development, Jamie Sarapuche, dismissed a reporter's question about the impact of free trade on Mexican culture. He stated, "This is very little relevance for Mexico. If you have the time, you should see the exhibition, Mexico 30 Centuries of Splendor, and you will realize there is no cause for concern." So here he's specifically referencing an art exhibition. This is the blockbuster exhibition Mexico Splendors of 30 Centuries, which featured over 350 Mexican paintings and sculptures and toured the U.S. in the 1990s. His attitude notably parallels President Scheinbaum's more recent comments. So for me, these two examples, decades apart, demonstrate how art and perceptions of cultural standing and prestige continue to figure in discussions of free trade. Typically, art is not considered a significant component of trade histories. However, in this book, I'm making the argument that examining art allows us to fully understand the dynamics of free trade in North America. This, I suggest, illuminates the ways that art is used by governments to advance new national and regional identities. It also allows us to understand how art is employed for dissent against these hegemonic narratives. So my interest in art and free trade was first sparked by artworks, and one of these is Free Expression, a composition that was created in direct response to free trade's implementation in the 1980s. In this scene, created by Canadian artists Carol Condé and Carl Beveridge, free trade dominates. It pulsates through the world in the form of a signal from a radio tower that is perched atop the planet. In the foreground, a man and a woman sit at a desk piled high with Canadian alternative arts publications like Tiger Lily and Fuse. Behind them, a third woman stands at their desk, raising her hand to stop the incoming march of cultural products from the United States. These are represented as a line of four men in business attire, with faces replaced by Fortune and Time magazines, as well as a television set that features George H.W. Bush's face. This was produced as a postcard, and it was circulated widely as a low-cost multiple in an issue of Fuse. But Free Expression really demonstrates a dramatic struggle, one in which one nation has the upper hand. It makes clear the artist's view that Canadian culture required protection, or it was doomed to be overwhelmed from competition south of the border under the new rules of free trade. National rhetoric was widely used in the period as a means to articulate opposition to free trade within Canada, especially within the cultural sphere. And this sentiment is also characteristic of many Canadian artworks that address free trade, despite the fact that the category of national culture was also at the same time being mobilized by free trade proponents. So this work, Free Expression, is just one of many that I uncovered in my research for the book, part of a rich stream of production by Canadian artists critically depicting free trade. And throughout the book, I highlight works like this, which have not yet been addressed as a group. And this is something we're going to hear more about this evening from our other two guests. But these works, it's worth mentioning, sit within a longer trajectory of cultural production commenting on North American dynamics, particularly Canada-U.S. relations. So the works on this slide date to 1972. And on the left, you'll see a work by London, Ontario artist Greg Furno. A ceramic version, I believe, of this work is held here at Museum London. Furno has carefully stitched together Canada and Mexico, envisioning a North America without the U.S. Several versions of this work were produced, including a color lithograph that came out in 1989, which is the year that the FTA was implemented. Now, on the right, there's a lesser-known work. This is a project from File magazine, which is a publication some of you might know because it was created by the Canadian art group General Idea. So this project was created by Robert Cumming with File and is a work of mail art that invited readers of File magazine to draw the Canada-U.S. border, resulting in a whole range of creative maps that responded to the 49th parallel. And this is just one of the responses that I found in the General Idea archive. So I share these two works to remind us how artists have continually and long been playing with representations of the region. In my research, I delved into understandings of North America as a region. So, in the early 21st century, North America appears as a natural, transnational regional unit consisting of three geographically proximate nations. They are linked economically, politically, culturally. But in fact, this vision had to be created. And prior to the late 20th century, North America really wasn't understood in this way. So, in the book, I delve into the history of how the Americas were understood as divided between Anglo and Latin America. Canada and Mexico were each preoccupied with the US and did not develop strong ties to each other before NAFTA. And this is a situation that you might describe as dual bilateralism. Therefore, a great deal of ambiguity surrounded the relationships between the three North American countries in the moment that NAFTA comes to play. So Canada's efforts towards Mexico around that moment were largely indifferent. Mexico's ties were divided between Anglo-America and Latin America. In the book, I really seek to emphasize how our ideas about North America have long been in flux, making the case that the version of North American identity projected at the turn of the millennium in art exhibitions is but one moment in an ongoing story about the continent. Discussions of free trade in art are complicated by the fact that culture was explicitly exempt at Canada's behest from the FTA. And this is an exemption that's later carried into other free trade agreements, including NAFTA and now the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement. The exemption explicitly excluded cultural industries from the trade deal. More than an economic concern, this demonstrates the value that the Canadian government placed on culture. As political scientist Patricia Goff argues, government efforts to protect cultural industries go beyond economic concerns to a desire to uphold the distinctiveness of their respective cultures and to maintain control of what is perceived to be an instrument of power in the reproduction of the political community. So for me, what's fascinating about art and free trade is that culture holds a contradictory role under free trade. It's always literally off the table at trade negotiations, exempt, while my research demonstrates that it was simultaneously highlighted as a vehicle for encouraging new economies and investments in Canada. Beyond this, culture was deployed to craft and promote new narratives about North America. The book is organized in a loose chronological order, grouped into three sections. So the first section sets the scene. It examines exhibitions and institutions as a form of cultural diplomacy prior to the period of free trade. Part 2 is the core of the book. It delves into how art shows work to construct narratives about North America amid and following economic integration under free trade. And the final section focuses on contemporary art. It focuses on art that was critical of free trade, showing how continental integration was contested. So I'd like to give you a sense of the case studies that I cover in the book. There's a lot of them, so I won't go into too much detail, but I'd like to touch on some examples, and I'm happy to answer questions after this presentation. So in chapter 1, I focus on the relationship between Canada and Mexico. I've already told you that prior to 1994, these countries really emphasized their respective bilateral relations with the U.S. rather than with each other. So in order to understand the role that art played in connecting Canada and Mexico, I started by trying to understand the history of Mexican art exhibitions in Canada. So one of the first of these was Mexican Art Today, a touring exhibition that marked the advent of formal diplomatic relations between Canada and Mexico and celebrated their alliance in World War II. So I use this history to contextualize a significant show that followed NAFTA later on in 1999, titled Mexican Modern Art 1900 to 1950. And my analysis of this exhibition demonstrates how the exhibition related to NAFTA and also explores the persistence of apolitical and exotic frameworks used in the display of Mexican art in Canada. And so I'm trying to understand the motivations of these exhibitions. And in this analysis of this one, I talk about how the show was used in service of cultural diplomacy, stressing the role of state actors mobilizing exchanges of cultural goods. The image that you see on the slide here was published in the Ottawa Citizen upon the opening of the show in Ottawa in the year 2000. It first opened in Montreal in 1999. And it shows an exchange, a moment between Canadian Heritage Minister Sheila Copps and Mexican Ambassador Ezequiel Padilla, highlighting the diplomatic spaces that are created by art exhibitions, which bring together numerous officials alongside cultural workers, artists, and patrons, all of whom are invested in North American relationships. The book also allowed me to look at unique examples of cultural diplomacy in the Canadian context. So one of these that I want to highlight is 49th Parallel. This is a gallery established by the Canadian government in New York City that ran from 1981 to 1992. And perhaps a nationally mandated gallery isn't that unusual. We have cultural centers, but these cultural centers tend to be very proximate to consulates or embassies. Rather, 49th Parallel was placed right in the heart of Soho, the heart of the art world in New York, in a building that housed other art galleries. So it wasn't immediately recognizable as a state diplomatic space. And rather than display works conventionally associated with Canadian nationalism, such as historic landscape paintings, we might think of the group of 7 here, 49th Parallel distinguished itself by focusing on leading edge contemporary art, all drawn from parallel galleries in Canada. And so it was operating in a period during which the free trade agreement was initiated and the NAFTA negotiations began. And it speaks to the significant investment that the Canadian government made in cultural initiatives as a means to advance trade relationships with the U.S. 49th Parallel's stated purpose was to encourage trade. So both in the wider sense, to encourage Canada-U.S. trade relations, but also in a specific sense, it was intended to help facilitate the sale of Canadian art in New York. And for me, looking at the history of 49th Parallel allowed me to understand better how cultural diplomacy was described in the period, and also the debates that surfaced around cultural diplomacy, because there's a big discussion of metrics. How could you know if cultural diplomacy at 49th Parallel was working? There were heated debates over quantitative and qualitative impact of this space. In terms of the narrative around 49th Parallel, it was an initiative that was not repeated again, despite its innovation. And it's often, in some ways, read as a failure for its closure in the early 1990s. But I suggest the gallery was a success and that it survived over a decade, and it brought together an incredibly diverse set of arts communities as well as diplomatic players. So the core of the book I mentioned looks at a series of exhibitions that promoted North American unity following NAFTA. So these included exhibitions like Carr O'Keefe Kahlo, Places of Their Own. And this aligned the national narratives of 3 female artists closely tied to their national canons: Emily Carr, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Frida Kahlo. So this exhibition was not government initiated, but largely in the press, it was read in relation to NAFTA and free trade. A lot of media coverage for the show invoked NAFTA, and the artists were characterized as the NAFTA Feminist 3. Another prominent exhibition in this period that I delve into in the book is titled Panoramas, the North American Landscape and Art. I mean, I think the title really evokes what they were going for here. But this was initiated as a bilateral project between Canada and the U.S., and later expanded to include Mexico. The exhibition was trilingual, and it also had a really captivating format for the moment. So it launched in 1999. It was a digital exhibition that was accessible online. Canada played a leading role in this project. It was the first initiative that was hosted by the Department of Canadian Heritage's agency, the Canadian Heritage Information Network. And it included substantial education programming. So not only were the messages available and open to the public, but this was something that was being promoted in classrooms across North America. So in this case, what we see is landscape art, which is conventionally tied to nationalist narratives, being used and repositioned in a manner to promote North American unity, North American cohesion. And what I also found interesting in terms of learning about this exhibition is that the exhibition was widely invoked at really prominent moments by government officials. So there would be meetings that had to do with trade and bilateral and trilateral relations. And they were talking about this exhibition as evidence of cooperation and closeness and kind of progressing further in their relationships. So exhibitions like panoramas demonstrate how the governments of Canada, Mexico, and the United States employed art to promote North American ties. And this continental framework was later picked up in subsequent exhibition projects that didn't receive state support, but it reveals how the spread of new readings of the continent that prioritized transnational links kind of developed and were later seen in subsequent exhibitions. Now, it's important to acknowledge Canada is a settler state, a product of settler colonialism, and this is a process in which the state works to naturalize itself, normalizing narratives that lay claim that its claims to the land are legitimate, despite being based on disavowal and violent displacement of Indigenous peoples. And at the same time, if you're thinking about cultural history, particularly in Canada, there is a long history of Indigenous visual material culture being co-opted by settler states who utilize it to evidence their distinctive nature, all the while systematically eradicating Indigenous culture and enacting on Indigenous communities. So in the book, I wanted to look at how Indigenous culture fits into these processes. So partially, I did this through looking at artworks like Rethinking Anthem by Nadia Mir. And this, you can see a still here on the screen, is a video that plays with a phrase from the Canadian national anthem, and a phrase that asserts settler ownership of the land and erases Indigenous histories. So it's a short performance. The work is shot with an aerial view where you can see two hands working simultaneously who are inscribing and erasing the lyrics, "Home and Native Land." And in the book, I focus on several exhibitions that feature Indigenous visual material culture, examining how they circulate ideas about Canada and North America. And one exhibition I found really fascinating was First Peoples of Canada, Masterworks from the Canadian Museum of Civilization. So this was a show that traveled to Germany, Japan, Mexico, as well as China. And in being a researcher and looking at this, what was really interesting to me is that I could access archival files that showed how the exhibition was promoted in all of these different spaces and see how the artworks were positioned differently to assert different messages in line with Canada's relationships to these different countries. So in the case of Mexico, the exhibition was mobilized to speak to similarities, to speak to close connections between Canada and Mexico, part of the Canadian government's formal America strategy at the time, which was all about building relationships across the hemisphere. In China, the exhibition was staged right at the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, and it emphasized Canadian resources and was promoted as a means for visitors to learn about Canada with the implicit assumption that there was a lot of differences between Canada and China. So in the final section of the book, I get to engage with contemporary art, and I'm talking about art as a venue for opposition to free trade. So the fifth chapter looks at the border. Of course, the borders in North America are increasingly contested. But what I was doing is looking at border zones as spaces of art production and sites where the fractures between states remain visible despite expanded economic integration under free trade. So one of my big case studies in chapter 5 is the art festival Insight, which some of you might be familiar with. This was often talked about as the border biennial, and it operated in between 1992 and 2005. It had different iterations located right on the border in San Diego, or the border that lies between San Diego and Tijuana. And so some of the projects I look at include site-specific installations by artists like Rebecca Belmore or Lewis Hawk. And my assessment of Insight addresses artistic treatments of the physicality of the border zone, contrasting them with works of art that have been produced at the Canada-U.S. border, which was largely perceived as a conceptual divide at the time. This is in the late 20th century. So this difference was especially marked before 9/11, which prompted a rebordering between Canada and the U.S. And then things, of course, are very different today as we look at that region. I found a whole trove of contemporary art videos, experimental videos about free trade and explicit rejection of free trade. Video is an easily disseminated medium. It has activist leanings.
And in the book, I argue that there's a substantial body of art addressing free trade in video from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So I undertake a visual analysis of numerous works and look at different tropes that emerge. And what I find is that video addressed cultural nationalism, critiqued free trade, it presented experimental narratives about North America. And importantly, there was a lot of video work that was artwork that documented anti-globalization protests, which were widespread in the period. So using diverse strategies from media talkback to performative investigations of nationalism, video served as a means to destabilize the reimagining of a North American region united by free trade. My examinations of video led me to discover more artworks and all sorts of other media addressing free trade. And one of these, which is incredibly delightful, is on the cover of the book. It's called State Dinner by Peter Dykes, a Halifax-based artist. And in this installation, what you're seeing is Dykes has utilized paper plates, on which he has rendered in watercolor the provinces, territories, and states that comprise all the countries in North America. So that make up Canada, Mexico, and U.S. And each of these is color-coded, and it reflects the dominant hue in the national flags of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. These works are installed in the wall on a grid and present a distorted map of North America, emphasizing the artificiality of national ties and the disposable nature of regional identity. The plates make reference to the economic aims of NAFTA, and they also, in this delightful way, really invert the pomp and circumstance that's typically afforded to state diplomacy. In concluding, I want to end by just emphasizing 3 key findings of my research. So first, I suggest that free trade had a significant cultural impact as it resulted in a conceptual reconfiguration of the continent and subsequently a realignment of national narratives. So through my project, I demonstrate the integral role of culture in this creation of a new North American identity, highlighting the ways that artists, museums, and curators responded to economic integration. So I suggest that art is a key way to understand this period. It's not the only way, but it is an important way. And the case studies that I've selected illuminate the different ways that art served as a means for the 3 North American governments, the 3 North American state governments, that is, to realign their national narratives in accordance with new economic and political alliances. And a pivotal part of this process was the promotion of an integrated North America with positive linkages between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. So I find that these exhibitions can be read as mediums of negotiation. That's the second key finding of my work. They're both illustrative and they're part of reconstituting these relationships in the neoliberal era. And third, through the case studies in the book, I'm making an argument that the Canadian government invested heavily in exhibitions, and kind of an unusual argument in this era where we're always complaining about arts funding. But what I'm arguing is that we can see the Canadian government valuing culture and investing in it to a greater extent than its American and Mexican counterparts, revealing in the moment the stock that the government placed in culture to advance its foreign policy agenda. So such investment makes clear that the government in Canada viewed cultural initiatives as an important tool for achieving economic and political goals. At the same time, I demonstrate there's a lot of nuance to this. Contemporary artists were equally engaged in these geopolitical transformations, in many cases directly critiquing the implementation of free trade in Canada. Art also documented direct activism happening around free trade, including anti-globalization protests. Ultimately, the reconsideration of the significance of culture to free trade attunes us to the many ways in which new narratives about North America and Canada and its free trade relationships might be messaged going forward. So I'd like to call everyone's attention to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was terrific. What a great way to start us off and set the stage for the arguments in the book, and to give us some context to welcome 2 very special guests who are going to link in and quilt us to the London community, to some of the broader areas that Sarah's outlining in her wonderful offering here. First up, Judith Rodger, the wonderful Judith Rodger, is a writer, art historian, and freelance curator. She began her career at Museum London, before it was called Museum London, followed by the Art Gallery of Ontario and the Macintosh Gallery at Western University, where I met you. She has been involved in an exhibition of Greg Cournot's work at the Art Gallery of Ontario that was also shown at Museum London. For the Art Canada Institute, she wrote the monograph, Greg Cournot, Life and Work. She is currently an adjunct professor in the Department of Visual Arts at Western University. When I originally sent an inquiry over to Judith about today's events, she remarked that she wondered what Greg Cournot would have made of Canada as the 51st state. And I thought, well, that's the perfect question to ask and pose to all of us. And we are so lucky to have Judith here to respond to that question for us. So please welcome, or join me in welcoming Judith Rodger.
So I'm really surprised to be speaking in this room, in this fashion, but delighted, and I couldn't resist. I have to say that I never thought about Greg Cournot in terms of free trade. And I did a look. I thought to myself, why is that? So I looked through the catalog that I did of his archive. Not once did I come up with the term free trade. And so it's not something that sprung to mind, but it's very interesting to re-examine his work through that particular lens. So I've called this part of it, Close the 49th Parallel, etc., because this was, as you will see, and this is Greg, when he was 28 years old in 1964, when he began to work on cultural imperialism, shall we call it that? Okay. So this is the work for Ben Bella, which he did in 1964. It's iconoclastic and irreverent. Prime Minister Mackenzie King is being zapped in the arm by an electric vibrator. Texts printed around the edges mock the trade deals King negotiated with the United States in the 1930s. The title links King with Ahmed Ben Bella, the 1960s Algerian revolutionary. Around the edges, he juxtaposes names, Mao, Castro, and Malcolm X, with Diefenbaker, Riel, and Tecumseh. The work embodies Cournot's interest in national liberation struggles and his idiosyncratic political stance. You will find it surprising, perhaps, that this was included in the Canadian Pavilion at Expo 67. Down there, I think the blue section by his feet, there's a note that that's where his little dog, is it Pat, used to sleep. So what happened to Cournot? In 1960, as in terms of his anti-Americanism, which I would suggest is very nuanced. In 1965, he went to New York City with Jack Chambers to help him transport works for an exhibition that Jack was having at the Forum Gallery. And he also went around with slides to various galleries in the hopes of having an exhibition in New York. So his anti-Americanism was not obvious at this point. However, the group of artists got together with Les Levine, who was an Irish artist who had come to Toronto in 1957 and then moved to New York. And they were mugged and they were chased by a gang of thugs. One of them broke off a Coke bottle and used it to slash Les Levine's neck, who ended up in hospital. You have to imagine, this is just a detail of the work, that there's a real Coke bottle hanging by a string here that's been broken off at the neck. And so this was a traumatic experience. And there are several people who think that this was the beginning of Greg's antipathy towards the United States, this personal happening. Now, in 1965, we had a new Canadian flag. Risa Greenberg pointed out that the design of the flag represented a shift from national icons, no Trans-Canada train, to images which specify edges or borders. I actually hadn't thought of this before, but it's an interesting thought. She added that in the 60s and 70s, Canada's economic and cultural policy was based on recognizing the existence of borders, especially that between Canada and the United States. And I was happy when I found this image today because there's the flag right on the 49th parallel on the map of Canada. This is Greg's iconic work, the camouflaged piano, or French roundels, which has been in the National Gallery since 1966. And I'm showing it to you because the pianist, with his back towards us, is Alec Kelly. Alec was the first PhD student in economics to come to Western. His wife, Beverly Lambert Kelly, was an artist, and they came from Saskatchewan. I forgot to say that. She wrote to Greg Kernall because she knew about him and his work. And he immediately invited the couple to join their circle. And they were at the York Hotel. And it was discovered that Alec Kelly was not only an economist, but he was also a good jazz pianist. So he played regularly at the York Hotel. So when I finally remembered this, I realized that there is a link between Greg and the economics department at Western, which was at the beginning of becoming one of the foremost ones in the country. When I go back. The economics department was Ronald Wonnacott, who was born and brought up and educated in London, Ontario, along with his brother, Paul Wonnacott. Both of them became respected economists, and they both went to the United States for their PhDs. Ronald Wonnacott to Harvard and his brother to MIT. They collaborated on this book. You read the title? Free Trade Between the United States and Canada, by the Harvard University Press, which is also interesting. But in those days, that would have been a real feather in their caps to have it published. So there we are in London, Ontario, with this book being published in 1967, and it became the book that was influential in making free trade part of Canadian public policy. So I thought I was excited when I found this. So here we are with Greg, with the connection with Alec Kelly. I can't prove that he knew Ron Wonnacott. I knew Ron Wonnacott, but I had no idea about this connection. So that's situating London at the heart of this. Now, another issue for Greg's antipathy towards the Americans was this famous mural, which we did have installed in this building in 2003, because we have, I think, probably the only wall in a gallery in Canada that's long enough to install it, because it's 110 feet long and it was right along the whole of the Ivy Gallery upstairs. And so it's very difficult to show, because of the size of it, to show it in a photograph that's not tiny like this. But it became, so there was a program in the 1960s to install Canadian artists in airports across the country. And Greg got the commission to do the airport at Dorval. And so he, in a matter of months, he did this enormous work, which is on steel panels with special paint. And he went to Dorval with a group of friends to install it. Now, the first panel that they installed was the 12th panel. Okay. Just let me, can I put that this one here? So that it was because of logistics. So they started from the middle, go that way. Second panel is the panel that I'm talking about. This is what it said. So you have to imagine we're in the tunnel in Dorval that goes under the runways to the arrivals area. And where there were moving sidewalks, some of you may have had that experience. And it didn't take long, like minutes, hours before U.S. customs officials and the RCMP began reading this and started to object. So it's a long story, but the whole work was installed. It was up for 4 days. There was much debate about, Greg said he would paint out the offending things, implying censorship, and that wasn't popular. So then he actually had to cover the 4 panels that were a problem with brown paper. And there was much debate going on. And then he came back to London and he heard from a friend at the London Free Press that they'd taken the work down. And after that, it sat in the National Gallery storage area until 1998, when it was taken into the collection. And just by chance, I happened to see that installation. They put it up on the walls, but they didn't have a space the way we did. So it went around the corners. And, but it's a landmark in Canadian art history. And there's much debate, much press about this particular work. So the next slide is a work here in Museum London, and I'm calling your attention to it. It's the first work that he did after the incident with the Dorval mural. And so it's called The True North, Strong and Free. And it was subsequently the Close the 49th Parallel, the second one in, was used on the cover of a 1970 book called Close the 49th Parallel, etc., The Americanization of Canada. This is a book from 1970. Then in 1969, I have to backtrack a little bit there, Colonel was asked to do a portrait of Pierre Elliott Trudeau on the cover of, in Maclean's. It wasn't on the cover, it was inside. He said, I tried to put Trudeau in the context of Mackenzie King's politics. There are few changes in Canadian politics. Mackenzie King fought British influences while the Americans fought up this country. I like Canada the way it is, in its inefficiency. The more inefficient we are, the freer we are, and we become less so with American control. Trudeau must pull us away from the U.S. It's to everyone's advantage to foster anti-Americanism in this country. Then, not so well known is his trip to Kingston in 1970 with John Boyle. And he went, there was a conference, and John Boyle read a manifesto that raged against American cultural imperialism. Colonel had 37 amendments, and they were deliberately humorous, xenophobic, and outrageous. And I put a few up here for you to read. He also went to Windsor and delivered all 37 to an audience which included Americans, and they got up and left. So here's the one. All Canadian atlases must show Canada's border to be with Mexico. Bridges and tunnels must be built between Canada and Mexico. So I wanted to put this one in because it shows you that in 1970, he was thinking about the elimination of the border before he did the map. Now, here is the famous map that's in the collection of the Dalhousie Art Gallery now on the left. And on the right, we have the cover of the Journal of Canadian Fiction. Colonel was commissioned to do a drawing for the cover of this journal. And when I got it out of the library the other day, I suddenly thought, I wonder why they asked him to illustrate this particular issue. So I went through the issue and I found that it included it's not fictional. The map is fictional, but there was a review of a reprint of a book by Goldwin Smith, who wrote in 1891, Canada and the Canadian Question. Smith's answer to the question was continentalism. Canada should embrace her destiny in a commercial union with the United States. This is in 1891. So I was astounded, actually. So it's very interesting to show you how long this particular debate has been going on. You also, if we had a look at the map for a minute, it's interesting what he chose to emphasize when he, apart from stitching the borders together, he also emphasized islands. That's because he was particularly interested in islands because they had a strong regional culture. And he visited many of them. And one of the ones that puzzled me was Clipperton Island. Fascinating story, Clipperton Island. You can look it up. But for Greg, it was interesting because it was a destination for amateur radio operators. And he famously had his own shortwave radio, which he installed during the Falklands War because he wanted to hear what was going on. Now, we have to skip forward to 1987. He had lots of other things going on in the intervening years, but this is an image from his studio of 3 text works tacked up to the board. I thought you might like to see how artists handle their works at the beginning. This was done for an exhibition of text works at YYZ in Toronto called I Tell Stories. And the next one shows you how they were exhibited together in a frame. This is Greg's own installation shot, so it's not a superb image, but I have another one thanks to the Gibson Gallery. The works have been separated and reframed. So you can see this one says, as a patriotic Canadian, in quotes, I respect and honor the priorities of our American comrades, close quote, Brian Mulroney. I don't think Brian Mulroney ever said that, but it makes the point. And the next one is Canadian nationalism is treasonous. And anti-Americanism is a crime against nature, Brian Mulroney. I'm at a loss to explain to you why the 1991 appears there. I don't know whether that was added later or not, but it's an interesting question. So that was 1987, he wrote those things. In 1988, in October, the 25th of October, we had the free trade election debate. This was a famous debate that some of you may remember watching between John Turner, who was the leader of the opposition, and Brian Mulroney. It was described as the mother of all election debates. It was over free trade between Canada and the U.S. Brian Mulroney had defeated John Turner and the Liberals in the 1984 election. Mulroney scored a coup in the televised debate that year by attacking Turner for making a series of patronage appointments that Pierre Elliott Trudeau had set in motion. And Turner said he didn't have a choice. And I remember it very clearly. Mulroney said, you did have a choice. And that was kind of when he lost the election. By 1988, we have Mulroney who had promised not to pursue or never to pursue free trade with the U.S. But as prime minister, he pivoted and negotiated just such a deal. By 1988, Turner sensed Canadians' unease about free trade and decided to make it the centerpiece issue of the election. So in October 1988, they had this debate. It's become legendary in Canadian political folklore. So actually, the Conservatives won the election, as you know, but the NDP and the Liberals had more votes, as happens in this country. So we know that most Canadians were not in favor of free trade during that election, but because of the way the system works, we ended up with free trade. And Greg and the artists, as you've seen from Sarah's discussion, were against free trade. So this is the level of the language. Turner says, I happen to believe that you sold us out. And Mulroney says back to him, you do not have a monopoly on patriotism. I think I'm going to skip ahead, read it. The debate. The next morning, I just figured this out today, October 26th, the morning after the debate, Colonel drew this map of North America, a new version, a Spanish version, which included a reference to Havana. If you look carefully, you can see Havana's marked on the map now. This is because there was an exhibition the next month, and here's the poster for the exhibition, which is in the Museum London collection, for 5 artists went to Havana, and it was actually Greg's first time in Latin America. He had been to Europe, but he had never, and he had been to the United States, but he had never been to Latin America. So that's 1988. And in 1989, Greg was the summer visual art studio head in Banff, Alberta, where they had a master print workshop. And so we were just after the free trade debates, slightly before the agreement was signed, and he made this new map of North America. It was a lithograph. There were 21 printed and some others included as well. And then the last iteration of the map is this ceramic map, untitled, from 1990. And I have a slide showing 3 versions of this map hanging in a gallery in Montreal in 1990. And here is Greg, somewhere in about this time period, in his studio, on the phone, as he loved to do, and surrounded by works and all the paraphernalia and the wonderful colored chairs that were very much a part of his studio. And these are the credits for the images that I used from the Museum London collection. And I'm grateful to Sheila Curnow, who gave me permission to use any works that I wanted to use. And I'm also grateful to Josh for asking me to do this and giving me the opportunity to have a new think about Greg Curnow.
Wow, so much there that I've never seen before, too, in terms of new content from Greg and in that context. Our closing hitter for tonight is Ruth Skinner, who works as an arts organizer, educator, and publisher in London, Ontario. She is currently working as community engagement and outreach coordinator for the School of Advanced Studies in the Arts and Humanities at Western University, and she's a past executive director of the Forest City Gallery here in London, Ontario. Her recent doctoral dissertation considered experimental publishing practices, artist books, forensics, and clairvoyance. You may have also seen an article she recently wrote for The Conversation entitled Stop the American Takeover of Canada, Inspiration and Humor from a London, Ontario art movement, an article that you should check out in the context of today's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Ruth Skinner.
Thank you. I did that nightmarish thing where I left my notes on the printer at work. And so you're going to deal with me rambling a little bit, but hopefully that will be all right. But I do want to start by saying thank you so much, Josh, for that really great framing to the evening. Thank you, Sarah, for the opportunity to be in dialogue with your excellent book. It's truly so, it was so enjoyable. And I have so many thoughts and I'm looking forward to the discussion. And Judith, I am endlessly inspired by your ability as an art historian to discover the most incredible synchronicities. So like, this is such a joy. I'm going to start. I'm here to talk a little bit about local artists, artist-run culture specifically is my wheelhouse, but I'm going to do a little national aside for a quick moment because my husband Andrew and I were just in Toronto and we went specifically to see the Joyce Wieland exhibition at the AGO Art On, which is beautiful. And like Curnow, Wieland has a very nuanced relationship with ideas of Canada, nationalism, very humored as well. And the exhibition, I think, does a really great job contextualizing that. At the same time, we wandered into the gift shop afterwards, and we both kind of realized, like at the very front of the AGO gift shop, it was like all Tom Thompson Group of Seven, and I'm like, oh right, okay, they're obviously perennially popular. But it just felt very, very emphasized in a way that was, it seemed to be very much in touch with this conversation, this elbows up moment, Canadian nationalism. And I was really grateful to have Sarah's book percolating, to have that context, that notion of how a lot of these images have been, a lot of these works have been calibrated to fit particular narratives at particular times. I didn't get an image of the gift shop. I wish I did. You've all seen these works in a variety of incarnations, cup, book, calendar, etc. But they're powerful works. And as Sarah remarks in her book and also here, Group of Seven works appear in a variety of exhibitions related to the imaging of landscape in this new transnational relationship. And that notion of landscape, she percolates on that for a minute. And she thinks about it in terms of what landscape comes to represent to a culture. And I think to quote W.J.T. Mitchell, who talks about landscape and its potential to shape a population's cultural imaginary. And so I see in the kind of new present moment of Elbows Up and Group of Seven and Tom Thompson, a kind of maybe recurrence or reversion where these works are no longer perhaps directed in a transnational narrative, but more of a very national narrative. I find that complicated for all of the reasons you might imagine. And a lot of people have written about the ways that these works, Seven works, Tom Thompson works, landscape works, have participated in the erasure of Indigenous identity from the landscape, for example. When you look at the AGO's social media right now, the last 6 weeks or so, I did a quick scan. There's a great deal of Group of Seven, Tom Thompson, and it's beautiful. There's a lot of amazing programming, but it is very remarkable. It was also just like, I think the anniversary of Tom Thompson's death and Lauren Harris's birthday, but it does feel very weighted in this direction. And so to think about these things at this time, I'm also trying to situate this kind of imaging, this visuality of Canada in relationship to some things that are happening politically right now. And so in the present moment, we have the Carney government discussing Bill C-5 with different populations, Indigenous, First Nations populations. And if you're not sure, Bill C-5 is a bill that is geared toward pushing forward development across the nation in the interests of Canada. But in doing so, it's bypassing a great deal of consultation. And understandably, there are many people who have mixed feelings about this for a variety of reasons. And I think the big thing that's being remarked upon by different news outlets is the fact that that consultation piece with First Nations is being sidestepped. And it's a little bit alarming for a variety of reasons. Just recently, APTN News reported on a 2-day summit that Carney had with Indigenous and First Nations leaders. And in that summit, he talks about the need for Canada to do more while at the same time affirming that there will be no changes to Bill C-5 at this time. And in response to that, historian Sean Carlton remarked that, quote, Canada has abandoned the path of reconciliation and nation-to-nation building in favor of a continuation of ruthless settler capitalism disguised as elbows-up nationalism. This isn't going to end well. I am not suggesting that Carney is in some way directing institutions like the AGO to push forward with this notion of let's do Group of Seven and Tom Thompson for what it can offer, our sense of elbows up mentality. But again, grateful to have Sarah's book in my mind as I think about some of her words around the context for these works. And I'll quote Sarah here. Ottawa's reconciliation agenda has been criticized as imposed on Indigenous communities, one that homogenizes Indigenous peoples, denies their sovereignty, and relegates settler colonial violence to the past, preventing an understanding of its ongoing and systemic nature, as well as its contemporary harms. And I think it's important to have that thinking in our minds as we're still enjoying these really beautiful, historic and very culturally important landscape works. I don't have my script. I was going to do a slightly snarky aside where I also talk about the triangulation of politics, art, and economics, but we can leave that for the conversation piece because I don't feel confident to do that here. Also in the AGO bookshop, there is this great t-shirt that they've designed, and it says, you can't maybe see it here, don't touch the art. And I find that to be really successful because they're leaning into what many institutions have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, that kind of institutional weight, but also that care for work, that there is a distance between the audience and the work by design. And I find this really funny, but I also think it's a great representation of what these institutions are in relationship to the cultural landscape of Canada. And as I mentioned, my wheelhouse is more artist-run culture. Artist-run centers exist in a really beautiful and complex ecosystem with larger arts institutions and with commercial art galleries. And they all work in a very integrated and nuanced way. But the history of artist-run culture is that it developed kind of in response to, in reaction against larger institutional spaces. And artists were really excited to get their hands on art and to get other people's hands on art through programming, through actions, through events and happenings. And so maybe it's a bit of a reach, but I just find when I saw this shirt, I was thinking of all of these kind of interesting connections. I don't want to take it for granted, but I'm also realizing that there are many people here who are like experts in London history. But I do want to give a little bit of context for artist-run culture, just to ensure that that kind of important, distinctive quality of that community is made clear. And I have a lengthy quote from William J.S. Boyle. He says, in response to existing institutions, unwilling or unable to accommodate the burgeoning artistic activity across the country, Canadian artists devised their own system, an innovative, flexible, and diverse network of spaces, which encouraged and responded to a new artistic climate. Artist-run spaces gave rise to a new ethos, creating an alternative art culture, which often supplanted the existing structures and their influence on the contemporary art scene. What began as a response to a larger institutional ecosystem became a system. With that change comes a questioning and perhaps another response. And A.A. Bronson, who's quoted in Sarah's book and will show up here again, he's written at great length about how eventually this kind of reactive, responsive, and agile artist-run culture did kind of become bureaucratic in its own way. That's okay, we can talk about that too. The oldest artist-run center by just a little bit is Western Front in Vancouver, followed closely behind by our own beloved Forest City Gallery. And this is its new location on Elias Street. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge other artist-run spaces in town. They might not necessarily receive the same level of public funding that a space like Forest City or Western Front does, but they are entirely artist-run and they're here to support artists in different ways. And that funding model is something I'd love to be able to talk about in conversation, that notion of federal, provincial, municipal funding, artist-run spaces, and artists are at the kind of fore of demanding that those funds be available and that those funds maintain with the economy. And you might know, but in case you don't, for example, the Ontario Arts Council hasn't received a consistent increase in its funding since 2009. That said, Mark Carney has committed to doubling funding for the cultural sector at the federal level. So we have a lot of kind of balance and complicated things to keep in consideration. Another artist-run community, Embassy Cultural House. You can see here Ron Benner and Dr. Anaí Gonzalez installing Intercambio Exchange at Support Project Space, which is yet another artist pop-up space that existed for a few years in the early 2020s. And as Sarah points out in her book, artist-run spaces were working both kind of in tandem with federal diplomacy activities, but also kind of counter to it. And in this particular exhibition, Anaí and Ron and a variety of other local artists, they exhibit all the different ways that they were able to make contact with cultural communities in Mexico. So glad you're right here. Judith mentioned the Havana, Cuba exhibition. Here is an image from that. So Canadian artist-run spaces were working outward constantly, building these incredible international relationships that were built in great part on this idea of regionalisms, but a kind of cosmopolitan regionalism. And here, keeping in theme with that diplomacy kind of element, you can see on the right, His Excellency, Mr. Michael Kurgan, who is Canadian ambassador to Cuba. This is a map. There are a few maps in this presentation of artist-run centers from the Artist-Run Centers and Collectives Conference, or ARCA. And it gives you a sense of this spatial kind of allotment of these spaces across the country. And I was thinking about this as it was discussed by both Josh and Sarah about what's going to happen. Is it going to be east-west or north-south? And clearly you can see that there is a delineation of a majority of the spaces really close to the border. And I think that definitely informs the philosophy, the ethos, and the kind of work that's being made. It's impossible for it not to do so. A.A. Bronson talks about the fact that this develops as a network, an almost living, breathing network. And that specific network quality sets Canada, artist-run culture in Canada, distinctly apart from other Western countries. Glenn Lewis talks about it as a kind of breathing ecosystem. In 1977, he did a full survey of the artist-run space environment at that time, and the way he writes about it is poetic and strange, but you get this sense of movement, constant movement and flux. And in 2011, there was a report on artist-run culture which affirmed that it is this networked activity that ensures that Canada remains very, very distinct in its cultural outputs when compared to other countries. Thinking back to that question of funding, I do want to quote A.A. Bronson at length, because in order for connection to happen across these spaces, particularly in the 60s and 70s, before the internet, we had to have a little bit of a financial support system. And for Bronson, that system came through the form of the Canada Council Travel Grant. He talks about that low-cost travel grant introduced in the early 1970s, which set the cultural community into trans-Canada motion and established the links and networking which has led to the art scene we have today. In a country where America is always closer than the next Canadian city, communications technology is not enough to establish a national culture. The travel grant single-handedly made that culture possible. And in thinking about that quote and looking at this image again, that east-west demarcation very close to the border suddenly feels like it's a little bit more lateral as opposed to horizontal, vertical. Judith talked about this at length so beautifully. I don't really need to talk about it anymore, but I will bring another map to your attention, which appeared in the London arts publication 20 Cents Magazine. Curnow was featured here numerous times. He also advertised the Nihilist Spasm Party in the magazine frequently as well. The cover of the magazine on the left pays homage to London as a test market city, thanks to its demographics, its population demographics, its situation in relation to the American border, and also other major cities in Canada and the U.S. It made London a perfect testing ground for companies, both Canadian and American. London artists paid attention to this. For some, it was quite a fraught thing, and for others, it was something you could have a lot of fun with. And as Judith mentioned, Greg kind of hovered between those two spaces in a very nuanced and complex way. But you can also see, not so nuanced on the right, is the advertisement for the Nihilist Party of Canada, yelling basically, it's time to say no, stop pollution, stop killing, stop exploitation, stop the American takeover of Canada. Get off your butt, do something, think negatively. And that's where I got the quotation for the conversation article that you can read at home on your own. So in researching for that article, I got the opportunity to talk to Jenny Kraling of Michael Gibson Gallery to ask her a similar question. What do you think Greg would think right now? And in her response, she thought he might be angry, but she was also really interested in thinking about the ways he might situate that anger, not so much as a kind of nationalism or patriotism, because he, like we all are starting to realize in a very, very concrete way, understood the dangers of how that kind of populist, nationalist energy can evolve. And I also asked her at that time about how this trade disaster landscape that we're living through is impacting not only Michael Gibson Gallery's capacity to sell artwork, but artists thinking about making artwork as a living going forward. And unsurprisingly, it's complex. You have artists who refuse to exhibit in the States. You have artists who are about to exhibit in the States, but for a variety of reasons are unable to, whether an exhibition is canceled due to the content, which happened to a London-based artist here, NG Quick, or whether the exhibition runs out of funding for a variety of other reasons related to their federal funding system. It's also like very granular because a number of artists will work with materials that are specifically American made. And that becomes a difficult thing to navigate both philosophically and also practically. At the same time, Jenny was optimistic in the moment she noted that Canadian art buyers tend to actually buy more Canadian art than we might expect, as opposed to looking south. So that gives us something to think about in terms of an opportunity for moving forward. And for me, my thinking through this current moment is also how might a federal, a provincial, a municipal funding structure be able to support artists where we are currently. And I'm really conscious as I started that I'm not thinking of an elbows up mentality because we know where that might lead us when we look south, but I am thinking about something nuanced and full of care. And I see artist-run culture as integral to that in order to support artists and in order to maybe push larger arts institutions in ways that we need to see them pushed in the coming bit of time. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Amazing. I'm going to look over at Sarah Monroe. Do we have time for a few questions? Okay, so why don't we get our three wonderful panelists to come up to the front stage. I'm going to take one of your mics and I'm going to see if you guys can share two of them so that I can ask questions in the audience. Some people can hear at home. You had mentioned very briefly in passing the Nihilist Band, and I did feel like it was important to recognize the loss of Bill Exley, who was the vocalist for the Nihilist Band. It's a huge loss for the London community, and if any friends and family are watching here today or online, our warm thoughts with everybody who knew Bill, a treasure of the London community. Okay, so maybe I could turn to Sarah quickly if you have any kind of quick responses to the thoughts that Ruth and Judith have shared.
Yeah, I mean, thank you both, Ruth and Judith. I think I'm continually struck. I mean, we all showed Kerno images this evening. I'm always struck by the the currency of Pernod's work, even though it's historic, how we're kind of rereading it in terms of the present day situation. And it's wonderful to see some of these ceramic versions of the Kernow map, which I'd never seen all of those versions before on display at YYZ. It's fantastic. Yeah, I'll leave my comments there for now, Josh. I think I'd love to hear other questions from you.
So anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments? Sarah's got a microphone that she's going to run through the room. Oh, there's one. Patrick.
Thank you all very much. That was amazing. Ruth, you threatened to talk about art and economics, and then you didn't. And it's hard for me not to encounter a panel like this and not be thinking about money the whole time. And we know that the, America as a place that artists work has a more robust, basically art market than Canada. And I don't want to talk about the art market, but I think the art market is something that's really kind of circling around all of this in one way or another. So I guess I have a few quick questions. One, Sarah, would be when you think about the paper plates on the cover of your book, I wondered if you could parse a little bit what Peter Dykes is doing with that work, paper plates with maps of states. And maybe you have something else to say about basically, art as commodity. And Judith, I was thinking about Greg's work, and on the one hand, the tremendous impact of it. On the other hand, as a marketable commodity, not always as marketable as, say, a painter's work would be. And even some of the scale sometimes and the awkwardness. So I wonder if you could say something about that. And Ruth, maybe you could just say something that you were going to say, because you did kind of refer to the problem for, we'll call it, young artists in making their work in affording materials. And I guess the question then becomes, does that mean that young artists are all thinking about fundamentally needing to rely on the market for, their living? So I know that's a lot, but maybe you could each just say something about money.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm glad to think a bit more about Peter Dykes' work. I was thrilled to be able to feature it on the cover of the book. And I think what he's doing is he's using they're called Royal Chinette plates. They have this kind of blue and gray design on the outside of the cardboard. It'd be something that many people here in the audience or watching at home would be familiar with. It's about it's very playful to me. I mean, I'd love to hear what Peter has to think about this, but it's a playful way of thinking about the disposability of culture. I also know he is very kind of open to like if you think about the reinstallation of the work and the different ways that it can be configured. It's something that eventually stacks up. It's incredibly portable. In terms of the larger question about thinking about the art economy, to me, well, the best example in the book is thinking about 49th Parallel, because 49th Parallel was this covert state cultural diplomacy project, but it was also designed to sell Canadian art. And this was one of the metrics at which it was accused of failing, because it's very difficult to sell artwork when you are a gallery that doesn't have a conventional roster, right? They were always bringing in new artists. They didn't kind of build an audience for them in New York. But there was this sense that the success of Canadian culture would be pegged to literal art sales. So I think that's something, Patrick, you're making me think of.
It's working. Greg and money, I think was your question. Well, it's an interesting question, but I have to say that he would not have survived as an artist if it hadn't been for the Canada Council. He started getting his Canada Council grants fairly early on, and some of them were quite substantial. And they were the ones that allowed him to travel across the country. I didn't mention that, but he really was everywhere in Canada, and he went as far south as Pelee Island. And in the same year, he went to Baffin Island, 2 islands again, and St. Pierre and Miquelon on the east coast. So the funding allowed him to become better known because he was giving talks or serving on juries. And he also was very fortunate to have Jake Moore, who was eventually the president of Brascan, the precursor to Brookfield. And Jake and Greg were friends, actually. They shared the similar values, but it was Jake, for instance, who took out the mortgage on 38 Weston Street so that Greg had that fantastic space to work in and in which to invite people and be hospitable and encourage other artists. So he also, though, I wanted to say he was very principled because he was asked to do a cover for Time Canada twice, and he turned it down, even at a time when he was not selling much work and finances were precarious. So he was really adamant about his anti-Americanism to the point where it hurt him financially.
Thanks for the question. Before I answer, I will plug that the Embassy Cultural House does have an exhibition coming up that is money focused. So this is definitely of concern to many folks right now. And I would follow Judith's point about council funding. I do believe that the public funding model in Canada is one of probably many factors, but a significant factor as to why we don't see that outsized art speculative marketing that we see in the States in terms of a kind of cultural cachet, but more importantly, an economic cachet, something that can hold that value. And at the same time, 20 Cents has a little moment in one of their issues where they celebrate getting a $500 Canada Council grant, quote, for the express purposes of keeping us alive. And I think of that often because as an artist who writes grants, I really feel that. Just a couple of years later, another arts publishing endeavor that's very dear, Applegarth Follies, were very explicit in that they would not accept any Canada Council funding because from their vantage, that kind of funding would restrict the kind of work that they have to do or that they could do. They didn't want to be answerable to particular expectations because when you receive a grant, you also have to report on your work. And so that creates a relationship that was uncomfortable. And I think that tension is important. I think artists right now are able to think through this multifaceted system that I mentioned of working with the Artist Run Center to help you in supporting your grants, earning your FARFAC fees, applying to the larger institutional spaces for a larger scale exhibition, building a relationship with a commercial art gallery. It's very much a kind of interlaced administrative and financial project.
Further questions, comments, remarks, thoughts?
Right there. I'm actually one of Dr. Smith's students from this year, but I wanted to offer just a different perspective because I'm personally 22. I was born in 2002. So a lot of the stuff we were talking about is kind of not ancient history to me, but it predates me. And so I was thinking about everything that's going on today, and especially coming of age in a time like this, everything feels within the short, expanse of my life feels very crazy and unprecedented. But I was really struck by how cyclical everything is and how true a lot of the satire and the humor in those pieces rings today. So it's kind of shifted my perspective. It's not unprecedented. It's unprecedented within my life per se and how long I've been around. But I guess it just goes to show how cyclical things can be and that arts and culture can be a really cool kind of roadmap. Like it's a very cool way to, I almost see it as like archaeology, like reverse engineering our own history and looking back at where we came from. There's so many sentiments and just contemporary concerns. Like there's so much people and things that are baked into art at the time when they make it. So I guess I was just wondering, when you're writing the book and doing your research, did you think it would be so applicable today? Did you kind of go into it with that understanding, like, history is cyclical, or did it come as a surprise like it did for me?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And thanks for coming. I think when I was doing a lot of the research for this book, it was in around 2008 to 2013. So it was this moment where ideas about North America, before I started looking into kind of the history and the ambiguity of North America and the sense that we hadn't always been as cohesive as I thought we had, I think in that period, it did feel like this cohesion was fairly settled. And then as I put the project aside for a while, and when I came back to it, that was more recently in the last couple of years, there had been this renegotiation of NAFTA, which now had a new name, no longer about North America, but privileging, this idea of discrete state identities, Canada-U.S. Mexico agreement. So I think I'd never expected really this moment when the book has been published to be really actively in a trade war and to be really thinking more carefully about what our relationship with the U.S. is like. But I think maybe the research in the book did open up a bit more ambiguity about North America for me.
Okay, we've got a Zoomer question here too, but it's worth noting in your lifetime, during the Trump administration, the renegotiation, we call it PUSMA here. In the United States, they call it the USMCA, USMACA, because in other words, they've been smacking us pretty good with that new treaty. We have a question from Basil, FIMS Basil, colleague, zooming in from us. In contrast to regionalism and nationalism, is there reason to think about and discuss globalization, the globalization of art as a way forward in a world that is becoming increasingly neo-populist, nationalistic, etc.? And I'm here not thinking about globalization in the sense of the history of capitalism, but rather in the sense that art production can be about looking and going abroad and experiencing other cultures as one way of thinking new and exciting art. Pose that to, imagine Sarah, but to anybody.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Basil. And I do really feel that art can be a catalyst for understanding. I think it's a very common experience. Probably many of you have been to the museum and felt like an effective response to an artwork. Art can be a way of understanding others. And certainly in cultural diplomacy research, we talk about art as a means to build mutual understanding, to build empathy, to build trust. That's why governments are so interested in investing in cultural diplomacy, because they feel that those connections can then be productively built on for kind of largely political, economic purposes. So I do feel that art offers a way forward. I don't know, can artists save the world? Maybe we should turn to Ruth and Judith. I don't know if you have a response.
There's part of your book where you discuss an exhibition where the curators, Ralph Rugoff is one of them. I can't remember the other one's name. I'm sorry. They talk about this notion, I'm being a bit pithy, but they're kind of like regionalism is over because we're so hyper connected that we have to think differently. We have to think more trans-regionalism, perhaps. And I always kind of get a little bit nervous, and I like to stay in spaces of both and I agree. I think that the kind of work that you saw artists like Ron, Jamili, Curnow doing in making these transnational contacts with other localized regional art spaces, both within Canada and without Canada, that was deeply, deeply important. But I don't think it necessitates having to be less mindful of the locale within which you live. And so to that case in point, there are conversations that are happening quite locally on a day-to-day level that young artists are wrangling with and that deeply impact their lives, whether it's a municipal budget or an arts council being able to fund or not. But I do think having that ability to look both locally and internationally is deeply exciting and important.
Okay, well, I'm getting the nod to wrap things up. I wanted to thank everybody who came today for today's event. This is a wonderful audience that joined us here on site in this beautiful space at Museum London. Thank you to Sarah Monroe for everything that you did to make this possible. Chuck, Lisa, Steve, new guy Steve, amazing. And I wanted to thank our panelists, our guest presenters, Ruth and Judith, for coming to do such a wonderful job to bring this home to London for us. And finally, I would really like to thank Sarah Smith, who emailed and said, is this an event? And I thought, oh my God, is that an event? It's a book about free trade right now. Amazing. I'm so glad you did reach out. This is such a wonderful opportunity to have a chance to celebrate your work, to have a conversation and gather together on issues of pressing concern. This question, as we all know, is not going away. Every week is a new fresh hell coming in from the news feeds. And I imagine it's going to continue that way going forward. So I hope today's event will offer some food for thought, some cogitations towards what a guiding thread forward. And if you want more of a guiding thread forward, could I recommend a book that you could purchase for reading, Sarah Smith's book, which is up for sale with the bookstore at Western. And thanks to the bookstore folks. Oh, the promo is coming up from the window here. Thanks to the bookstore for coming to sell books. That's a really nice service that you guys do. So thank you very much. Thank you to the Zoomers online who joined us from near and far as well.